$50 a battered Henry rifle and a half-blind pack mule. That was the price of a human life in the Wyoming Territory, 1878. Sadie didn't cry when her own flesh and blood traded her to a scarred, quiet man twice her age. Tears froze to your eyelashes out here anyway. People said Harlan was half grizzly, a hermit who lived where the snow never melted. She expected brutality. She expected the end. What she got was a man who actually knew how to build a fire and keep her warm. The trading post at Fort Laramie smelled of wet wool, stale whiskey, and the metallic tang of desperate men. Wind battered the rough-hewn log walls, rattling the oil lanterns suspended from the low ceiling. Dust hung in the pale, freezing shafts of light that bled through the single frosted window. Sadie sat on a barrel of salted pork, her hands tucked tight beneath her armpits. She was 22, but the plains had a way of aging a woman from the inside out. Her dress was faded calico, patched at the elbows, and frayed at the hem, doing absolutely nothing to keep out the bitter November draft. Beside her stood Caleb, her brother. He shifted his weight from boot to boot, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered coyote. Caleb had always been weak. The West didn't tolerate weakness. It chewed it up and demanded a toll. Today Sadie was the toll. "I need 70. Caleb muttered, his voice cracking. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. The man standing across from them didn't flinch. He didn't bargain. He simply stared. His name was Harlan. Sadie had heard the whispers around the fort. He was a mountain man, a relic of a bygone era before the railroads and the cattle barons started carving up the territory. He stood well over 6 feet broad across the shoulders, but lean, stripped of any soft living. His beard was thick, wiry, and shot through with iron grey. Deep lines etched the corners of his pale blue eyes, eyes the colour of a frozen lake. A massive buffalo hide coat draped over his frame, and the leather of his boots was scarred by rock and ice. He looked less like a man, and more like a piece of the mountain that had broken off and walked down into the valley. 50, Harlan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the low, rumbling weight of a rock slide. A Henry rifle, and the mule tied to the post outside. Caleb swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He owed money to men who didn't send debt collectors, they sent undertakers. He looked at the leather pouch in Harlan's calloused hand, then at the rifle slung over the mountain man's shoulder. "Deal?" Caleb rasped. Harlan tossed the heavy coin pouch. Caleb caught it, the silver clinking inside. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't offer a reassuring lie. Caleb turned on his heel and walked out the heavy timber door, disappearing into the swirling white dust of the frontier. Sadie didn't move. She felt hollowed out, a dry husk left in the sun. She had been property to her father, a burden to her brother, and now she was a purchase to a stranger. She knew what men were. She knew their heavy hands, their sour breath, their petty, violent demands. She closed her eyes for a second, bracing herself for the rough grip on her arm, the harsh command to follow. Instead, a shadow fell over her. She opened her eyes. Harlan stood 2 feet away. Up close, he smelled of pine pitch wood smoke and old leather. There was a jagged scar running from his left temple, down to his jawline, disappearing into the grey beard. He didn't reach for her. He didn't look at her with the hungry, possessive gaze she had come to expect from men at the fort. "You got a heavier coat?" he asked. Sadie shook her head. Harlan gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod. He unspooled a thick woolen blanket from his pack and tossed it to her. "Wrap up. We got 20 miles of elevation to cover before the sun drops." He turned and walked out. Sadie hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pulled the coarse wool around her shoulders and followed him into the biting cold. The journey out of the valley was a grueling, silent affair. Harlan rode a massive roan gelding, while Sadie sat astride a stout, sure-footed mare he had waiting by the livery. For the first 2 hours, the terrain was flat, a sweeping expanse of dead prairie grass whipping in the wind. But as they pushed north, the earth began to violently thrust upward. The Black Hills loomed ahead, a jagged fortress of dark pine and granite. The temperature plummeted with every 100 feet of elevation. The wind howled through the canyons, a sharp physical force that bit through Sadie's blanket and dress, freezing the sweat on her skin. Her hands grew numb, the leather reins slipping through her fingers. She clamped her jaw shut to keep her teeth from chattering, determined not to show weakness. If she was going to die up here, she wouldn't give this stranger the satisfaction of hearing her beg. By late afternoon, the snow began to fall. Not soft, drifting flakes, but hard, driving pellets of ice that stung her cheeks. The trail narrowed to a treacherous shelf of rock, hugging the side of a gorge. One slip of the mare's hooves meant a drop of 300 feet into the frozen river below. Suddenly Harlan hauled back on his reins. The roan stopped. Harlan dismounted, his heavy boots crunching into the accumulating snow. He walked back to Sadie. She stiffened, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The isolation was absolute. Whatever he wanted to do to her, there was no one in a 50-mile radius to hear her scream. Harlan stopped beside her mare. He looked up at her, noting her blue lips, the violent tremors shaking her small frame. Without a word, he unbuttoned his massive buffalo hide coat. He shrugged it off, standing in the freezing wind, in nothing but a wool shirt and suspenders. He reached up, grabbed the collar of the coat, and draped it heavily over Sadie. The weight of it nearly crushed her. It was entirely lined with thick fur, radiating the immense body heat of the mountain man. Instantly the wind ceased to exist. The warmth enveloped her like a physical embrace. She stared down at him, stunned. "You'll freeze!" She forced out her voice, barely a whisper against the wind. Harlan swung back onto his horse. "I'm used to it. You ain't. Hold tight. An hour left." He didn't look back. He just spurred his horse forward into the whiteout. Sadie pulled the heavy fur collar up around her face, inhaling the scent of smoke and sweat. For the first time in her life, a man had surrendered his own comfort to ensure hers. It broke every rule of the world she knew. As the mare tramped steadily behind him, Sadie realized she had absolutely no idea who this man was. The cabin appeared not as a structure, but as a continuation of the mountain itself. Built tight against a sheer face of granite, it was constructed of massive, unpeeled lodgepole pines, their gaps chinked thick with mud and dried moss. A tin chimney poked through a roof, heavy with 2 feet of snow, exhaling a thin, steady ribbon of grey smoke. It sat at the edge of the timberline. Above them there was nothing but bald, wind-scoured rock and the grey sky. Below them, a sea of dark forest stretched out into oblivion. Harlan dismounted and took the reins of her mare. Sadie slid from the saddle, her legs instantly giving way as they hit the ground. The cold and the long ride had turned her muscles to water. Before she could hit the snow, Harlan caught her by the elbow. His grip was like a steel vice, impersonal, incredibly strong, but completely devoid of cruelty. He hoisted her upright. "Inside!" He grunted, pointing toward the heavy plank door. Sadie stumbled forward, dragging the buffalo coat with her. She pushed the door open and stepped over the threshold. She had expected a hovel. The men she knew lived in filth, surrounded by empty bottles, spittoons, and rot. Harlan's cabin was a shock to her senses. It was small, a single room, but it was immaculately organized. The floor was hard-packed, earth swept clean. Cast-iron skillets and pots hung from iron hooks over a massive stone hearth. Bunches of dried herbs, sage, yarrow, wild mint, hung from the rafters, filling the air with a sharp, clean scent. A massive cord of split firewood was stacked neatly against the interior wall. In the corner sat a sturdy wooden bed frame, layered with thick furs, and a brightly patterned Navajo blanket. There was no clutter. Everything had a purpose. It was a space built strictly for survival, yet it possessed a stark, austere dignity. Harlan ducked his head to clear the doorframe, carrying her saddlebags. He dropped them on a wooden bench, then immediately went to the hearth. He fed kindling into the glowing embers, blowing softly until a flame caught. The fire roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows across the log walls. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a sturdy three-legged stool near the fire. Sadie sat. She watched him move. For a big man, he moved with a fluid, terrifying economy. No wasted motion. He filled an enamel pot with water from a bucket, swung it over the fire, and began slicing a slab of salt pork with a hunting knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. The silence stretched. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence. Sadie was used to the kind of silence that preceded a drunken rage or a backhand. It was just quiet. The mountain was quiet. Harlan was quiet. When the food was ready, he set a tin plate in front of her. Pork beans and a wedge of hardtack biscuit. He poured her a cup of black coffee that tasted like burned earth and salvation. She ate ravenously, her manners forgotten. Harlan ate leaning against the mantelpiece, his eyes fixed on the flames. Then came the night. The wind outside picked up, screaming around the corners of the cabin like a dying animal. The fire burned low. Sadie washed her plate in the tin basin, her stomach knotting tighter with every passing second. This was the moment. The transaction had to be completed. $50 didn't buy a house guest. It bought a wife, a body. She stood by the hearth, her back to him. Her hands shook as she reached for the buttons of her calico dress. She slipped it off her shoulders, letting it fall to the floor. She stood in her thin cotton chemise, the firelight illuminating the faded yellow bruises on her ribs, gifts from her brother's short temper. She walked to the large bed in the corner, pulled back the heavy furs, and sat on the edge, staring at her bare feet. She squeezed her eyes shut. Just endure it, she told herself. Just go numb. She heard Harlan's heavy boots cross the room. The floorboards creak. He stopped at the foot of the bed. Sadie held her breath, her fingernails biting into her palms. A heavy woolen object hit her square in the chest. She gasped, her eyes flying open. It was her dress. Harlan stood there, his face unreadable in the dim light. He looked at her bare, bruised shoulders, then deliberately shifted his gaze to the wall. "Fire goes out around 2 in the morning." He said, his voice flat. "It gets cold enough to kill a body. Put your clothes back on. Get under the furs." Sadie stared at him, paralyzed. "But you—" "I sleep by the door." Harlan interrupted. He turned his back to her and walked across the room. Against the far wall, tucked beneath the window, was a narrow, uncomfortable-looking cot made of stretched canvas. He unlaced his boots, lay down on the cot, fully clothed, and pulled a single moth-eaten blanket over himself. "Blow out the lantern, Sadie," he said into the darkness. She fumbled with her dress, pulling it back over her head, her mind spinning in complete disorientation. She climbed under the heavy furs of the main bed. The mattress was stuffed with dry pine needles. It smelled like the forest. It was warm. It was safe. She lay awake for hours, listening to the wind batter the cabin and the slow, rhythmic sound of Harlan's breathing across the room. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't demanded anything. For a girl who had been bought for $50, it was the most terrifying thing in the world. She didn't know the rules here, and in the Wild West, not knowing the rules usually got you killed. Winter locked the mountain down like an iron vault. By mid-December, the snow was piled to the eaves of the cabin. They were marooned in a sea of white. Fort Laramie Caleb, the dusty trading post, they all felt like hallucinations, fever dreams from another life. Routine became their religion. The harshness of the environment demanded absolute discipline, and Sadie quickly realized that survival up here was a two-person job. Harlan never explicitly ordered her to work, but the work was everywhere, and she threw herself into it. Idle hands bred panic, and she refused to panic. She woke before dawn, slipping from the warm cocoon of furs to revive the fire. She learned to make sourdough biscuits in the Dutch oven, burying the heavy iron pot in the coals. She mended Harlan's clothes, her needle pushing through the thick wool and leather with increasing dexterity. Harlan, for his part, was a ghost in the snow. He would leave before the sun breached the horizon, strapping on long wooden snowshoes, his Henry rifle slung across his back. He hunted. He checked traps. He hauled water from the frozen creek, smashing the ice with an axe. They moved around each other like two solitary wolves forced to share a small cave. Wary, observant, completely silent. But silence has a texture, and slowly the texture began to change. It happened in the 3rd week of January. A blizzard had rolled in a ferocious whiteout that obliterated the sun for 3 solid days. Harlan couldn't hunt. They were trapped inside, the wind shrieking so loudly it rattled the cast-iron pots on their hooks. On the 2nd afternoon of the storm, Harlan sat by the fire, a piece of seasoned hickory in one hand and his carving knife in the other. Wood shavings curled onto the hearthstone. Sadie was sitting on the floor nearby, struggling to oil a stiff piece of harness leather. Her fingers were cramped, her knuckles raw and cracked from the dry cold. Harlan stopped carving. He watched her struggle for a moment. Then he stood up, walked to a wooden shelf, and retrieved a small tin. He walked over and dropped it into her lap. Sadie looked down. It was a tin of rendered bear fat mixed with crushed yarrow and beeswax. "Rub it on your hands," he said gruffly. "Skin splits up here, it gets infected. You lose fingers." He sat back down and resumed carving. Sadie opened the tin. The salve smelled earthy and pungent. She rubbed it into her cracked knuckles, feeling the immediate soothing relief as the fat hydrated her abused skin. She looked over at him. His large, scarred hands worked the knife with surprising delicacy. He wasn't just whittling to pass the time, he was shaping something intentional. "Why did you buy me?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. They hung in the air, loud and sharp, against the roar of the wind outside. Sadie froze, instantly regretting it. "You didn't question men like Harlan. You stayed out of their way." Harlan didn't stop carving. The knife made a rhythmic shh sound against the wood. He didn't answer for a long time. Sadie thought he was going to ignore her. Finally, he blew the sawdust off the wood. "Broke my leg 3 winters back." Harlan said, his voice a low gravel. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the fire. Slipped on a patch of black ice down by the ravine. Bone snapped clean. Pushed through the skin. Sadie winced. She knew what a compound fracture meant in the wilderness. It was a death sentence. "Crawled 2 miles back here." Harlan continued. "Took me a day and a half. Dragged myself by my elbows. By the time I got to the door, the fire was dead. I lay on that floor for 4 days, setting the bone myself, burning the wound shut with a hot iron to stop the rot." He paused, the knife resting in his lap. "I survived. But I realized something. A man gets old. He gets slow. You break a leg out here alone and the fire goes out. You freeze before the infection can even kill you." He finally turned his head and looked at her. His icy blue eyes were unblinking, devoid of pity, devoid of romance. Brutally pragmatic. "I didn't buy a wife, Sadie," he said. "I bought an insurance policy. I needed someone to keep the fire going if I don't make it back before dark. Saw you sitting on that barrel. You had a hard look to you. Figured you knew how to suffer without quitting." Sadie stared at him. It was the longest string of words she had ever heard him speak. And it was the most honest thing a man had ever said to her. No lies about love, no drunken promises, just brutal, necessary truth. She was a tool for survival. Oddly, it was immensely comforting. "And my brother?" she asked, her voice steady. "Your brother," Harlan said, turning back to his carving, "is a fool. He sold a workhorse for the price of a pony. He'll be dead in a ditch over a poker game before spring." He didn't say it with malice. It was just an observation. A long silence stretched between them, But this time the tension was gone. The air felt cleared. Sadie looked down at her oiled hands. "I can shoot," she said quietly. "A little. If you teach me the Henry, I can hunt the ridge while you run the traps down low." Harlan's knife paused. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye. A faint, almost imperceptible shift happened in the rigid set of his jaw. It wasn't a smile, not quite, but it was an acknowledgement. "Rifle kicks like a mule," he warned. "I've been kicked by worse," Sadie replied without missing a beat. Harlan grunted. He tossed the piece of wood he had been carving across the short distance between them. It landed on the floor by her knee. Sadie picked it up. It was a heavy wooden comb carved from the hickory, the teeth perfectly spaced and sanded smooth. It was beautiful. "Your hair's getting tangled," Harlan muttered, standing up to check the beans over the fire. Sadie ran her thumb over the smooth wood. She looked at the man's broad back, the scars, the grey hair. She realized with a sudden, overwhelming clarity that she was not afraid of him. For the first time in her 22 years, she was in a room with a man miles away from civilization, and she felt entirely safe. The transaction was over. The partnership had begun. The Henry repeating rifle was a beautiful, terrible piece of machinery. The receiver was solid brass, gleaming dull and cold in the flat winter light. The stock was bruised walnut slick with oil and sweat. To Sadie it felt less like a tool and more like a heavy sleeping animal in her hands. February brought a brittle snapping cold that crusted the deep snow with a layer of sharp ice. Harlan took her out behind the cabin 100 yards up the ridge where a dead pine had been struck by lightning. He wedged a piece of charcoal into the pale, splintered wood of the trunk. 15 rounds in the tube. Harlan said his breath pluming in the freezing air. He stood slightly behind her, his voice low over her right shoulder. "You don't load until you intend to kill. You don't aim until you know what's behind your target. And you don't pull the trigger. You squeeze it." Sadie hoisted the rifle to her shoulder. It weighed over 9 pounds. Within 10 seconds her arms were trembling. "Elbow down," Harlan instructed, tapping her right arm with a gloved hand. "Lean into it. Let the wood take the bone. If you fight the kick, it'll break your collarbone." She adjusted her stance, tucking the brass butt plate tight into the pocket of her shoulder. She closed her left eye, aligning the rear notch with the front blade. The charcoal mark hovered in her vision, dancing as her muscles strained against the weight. "Breathe in," Harlan commanded. "Let half of it out. Hold. Squeeze." Sadie squeezed. The hammer dropped. The explosion was deafening. A massive gout of white smoke erupted from the muzzle, blinding her. The rifle bucked backward with the force of a kicking mule. The brass butt plate slammed into her shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain down her spine. Her teeth rattled. She stumbled backward, her boots slipping on the icy crust, but Harlan caught her by the belt, steadying her. As the wind tore the gun smoke away, she looked at the tree. The charcoal mark was untouched. A spray of fresh splinters showed 2 feet to the left. "You flinched," Harlan said simply. He stepped away. "Lever it. Go again." They stayed out there until her shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening ache, and the sharp smell of sulphur coated the back of her throat. By the 15th round, her arms felt like lead weights, and a deep purple bruise was already blooming beneath her heavy wool coat. But the charcoal mark was gone, replaced by a ragged, splintered hole in the center of the dead pine. Harlan walked to the tree, ran a thumb over the fresh wood, and nodded once. "Clean it when we get inside," was all he said. For the next 3 weeks, Sadie carried the Henry whenever she stepped out of the cabin. She learned the weight of it, the balance point just ahead of the receiver, the metallic clack of the lever action. She learned to respect its violence. Her test didn't come on a sunny afternoon against a stationary target. It came in the dead of night, in the middle of a screaming windstorm. She woke to the sound of frantic kicking. The heavy wooden door of the lean-to attached to the cabin where the mule and Harlan's roan were stabled was rattling violently on its leather hinges. The mule was braying a high, terrified sound that cut straight through the howl of the wind. Harlan was already up, shoving his feet into his boots. He grabbed a lantern but didn't light it. "Cougar!" he grunted, reaching for a short-barreled shotgun above the mantel. "Stay here." He slipped out the door, disappearing into the pitch-black, swirling snow. Sadie didn't stay. She threw off the furs, shoved her bare feet into her leather boots, and grabbed the Henry. She didn't bother with a coat. Adrenaline pumped hot blood through her veins, overriding the freezing air. She pushed the cabin door open. The wind nearly tore it from her grip. The darkness was absolute, save for a faint, chaotic scuffling coming from the lean-to. She stepped out into the knee-deep snow, moving blindly along the log wall. A sudden, terrifying snarl erupted from the shadows, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the timber. "Harlan!" Sadie yelled. No answer, just the frantic stamping of hooves. She rounded the corner of the lean-to. The clouds parted for a fraction of a second, letting a sliver of moonlight bleed through. It was enough. The mountain lion was massive, a tawny shadow of muscle and desperation, driven mad by the winter famine. It was on the roof of the lean-to, tearing at the cedar shakes trying to get to the panicked animals inside. Harlan was below it, struggling to get a clean angle with the shotgun without hitting the horses. The lion heard Sadie's boots in the snow. It turned. Its eyes flashed green in the darkness. It didn't retreat. It gathered its hind legs, its powerful shoulders bunching, preparing to launch itself off the low roof directly at her. Sadie didn't think. Training took over. She brought the heavy barrel up, tucked the brass tight into her shoulder. Inhaled. Exhaled half. The lion sprang. Sadie squeezed. The Henry roared a jet of orange flame, illuminating the falling snow. The recoil punched her backward, knocking her flat into a snowdrift. Silence slammed back down onto the mountain, broken only by the ringing in her ears and the wind. Sadie scrambled to her feet, working the lever, chambering another round her hands, shaking so violently she nearly dropped the gun. Harlan struck a match, lighting the lantern. The yellow glow pushed back the dark. The mountain lion lay dead 6 feet from where Sadie stood. The heavy .44 caliber slug had caught it mid-air right behind the shoulder. Harlan stood holding the lantern. He looked at the massive cat, then walked slowly through the snow to Sadie. He looked at her bare, freezing arms, her trembling hands gripping the rifle, and the wild, terrified look in her eyes. He reached out and gently pushed the barrel of the Henry down toward the ground. Pelts ruined. He murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. But the shot was true. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. April arrived not with warmth, but with violence. The great thaw began turning the mountain into a treacherous, shifting landscape. The snowpack rotted from beneath, sending millions of gallons of ice water tearing down the granite gorges. The air smelled of wet pine, churned mud, and decaying leaves. The world was waking up hungry. The thaw also meant the high passes were open. The absolute isolation of winter was over. They were running dangerously low on flour and coffee. Harlan decided to hike down to a lower cache, and he kept in a dry cave, 3 miles down the valley, leaving his horse behind due to the deep, unstable mud. "Keep the door barred," he told Sadie, slinging a canvas sack over his shoulder. "Keep the rifle loaded. Don't open it for anyone." "Who would come up here?" Sadie asked, sweeping the packed dirt floor. "Desperate men." Harlan replied, his eyes narrowing as he looked down the valley. "Spring flushes them out of the low country. Just keep the bar thrown." He left just after dawn. By midday, the temperature had climbed enough that Sadie had to open the small, oiled paper window to let the heat of the cooking fire escape. She was scrubbing a cast-iron skillet with river sand when she heard the horses. The sound was faint at first, the suck and pull of hooves in deep mud. She froze. The mule in the lean-to gave a low, nervous whinny. Sadie dried her hands on her apron, walked to the corner, and picked up the Henry. She moved to the window, keeping her body pressed against the log wall, and peered through the narrow opening. 3 men rode into the clearing. They didn't look like trappers or prospectors. They looked like trouble. Their horses were raw-boned and exhausted, lathered in sweat despite the chill. The riders wore mismatched, filthy clothing, stolen Union cavalry coats, and rotting leather. The man in the lead, a thick-necked brute with a tangled black beard and a missing left eye, carried a rusty Spencer carbine across his saddle pommel. "Hello, the cabin?" The leader yelled, his voice ragged. Sadie didn't move. She held her breath. "Smoke's coming from the chimney, Garris." One of the other men muttered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the slush. "Somebody's home." Garris spurred his exhausted horse a few steps closer. "We ain't looking for trouble. Just a hot meal and a dry place to rest our mounts." It was a lie. Sadie could hear it in the slick, eager grease of his voice. She checked the chamber of the Henry. A brass cartridge sat heavy and ready. "I say we just go in!" The third man snarled. He spurred his horse forward, drawing a heavy revolver from his belt. "Stop right there!" The voice rang out from the tree line. It was deep calm and carried the crushing weight of a falling tree. The 3 men jerked their horses around. Harlan stood at the edge of the clearing 20 yards away. His canvas sack lay dropped in the mud behind him. His short-barreled shotgun rested easy in his hands, aimed loosely at the men's chests. Garris squinted, sizing Harlan up. He saw the grey in Harlan's beard, the slight limp in his left leg. He saw an old man. "Well now, old-timer," Garris sneered, resting his hand on his carbine. "You wouldn't turn away weary travelers, would you? We just want what's inside that cabin." "Cabin's closed," Harlan said. "Turn your horses around. Ride back down the ravine. You won't make it to the pass before dark." "I don't take orders from ghosts." Garris spat. He looked at his men and nodded. The third man raised his revolver, aiming directly at Harlan. Before his finger could find the trigger, a thunderous crack echoed across the clearing. The man screamed, dropping the revolver as a .44 caliber slug tore through his bicep, shattering the bone. His horse reared, bucking him off into the freezing mud. Garris and the second man whipped their heads toward the cabin. Through the open window, the heavy brass barrel of the Henry rested steadily on the sill. White smoke curled from the muzzle. Sadie stood behind it, her eyes cold, her cheek pressed to the wood, already working the lever to chamber another round. The metallic clack-clack was loud and definitive in the sudden silence. "Next one takes the man in the center." Sadie called out, her voice hard, echoing off the canyon walls. "Drop the carbine." Garris stared at the dark window, then back at Harlan. The old mountain man hadn't even flinched when the rifle fired. He just stood there, the shotgun now leveled dead at Garris's face. The odds had changed. It wasn't an easy ambush anymore. It was a crossfire. Garris slowly lifted his hands, letting the carbine slide off his saddle into the mud. "All right, we're going. Take your trash with you." Harlan growled, nodding toward the man bleeding in the mud. The uninjured rider dismounted, hauled his groaning companion over the back of his horse, and scrambled into the saddle. Garris gave one last venomous look at the cabin window, then spurred his horse hard back down the muddy trail. Harlan watched them until they were completely out of sight. He waited another 10 minutes listening to the forest. Then he picked up his sack and walked to the door. Sadie let him in, quickly sliding the heavy oak bar back into place. Harlan dropped the sack on the table. He walked over to the fire and stood with his back to it. He looked at Sadie. She was leaning against the wall, the heavy rifle still in her hands. Her face was pale, and a fine tremor was shaking her knees. Shooting an animal was one thing. Putting a bullet through a man's flesh was another entirely. Harlan didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it was okay. He walked over to her gently, took the rifle from her rigid hands, and set it on the table. "You didn't flinch," he said quietly. "Adrenaline is a liar. It makes you feel invincible right up until it leaves your blood, and then it leaves you hollow and freezing." Sadie sat on the three-legged stool by the hearth, staring at her hands. They were shaking. The smell of black powder clung to her hair, an acrid reminder of the violence that had just ruptured their quiet world. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image of the man falling into the mud, the bright spray of red against the brown earth. Harlan moved around the cabin with his usual economy. He bolted the heavy wooden shutters over the window. He stowed the groceries from the sack. He didn't hover over her, but he didn't ignore her either. He poured a cup of coffee, laced it heavily with a rare splash of amber whiskey from a small flask, and set it on the stone hearth near her knee. "Drink," he ordered softly. Sadie picked up the tin cup with both hands. The hot liquid burned down her throat, settling the frantic fluttering in her stomach. As she drank, she watched Harlan unbutton his heavy canvas coat. When he pulled it off, he winced a sharp intake of breath, hissed through his teeth. Sadie set the cup down instantly. "You're hurt. It ain't nothing," Harlan muttered, keeping his back to her. He reached for the hem of his wool shirt to pull it over his head, but his left arm stiffened, refusing to raise all the way. Sadie stood up. The lingering shock evaporated, replaced by a sudden fierce focus. She walked across the room, stepping directly into his space. She didn't ask for permission. She grabbed the hem of his shirt and gently pulled it up and over his head. Harlan froze his massive frame rigid. When the shirt came off, Sadie gasped. Running along the left side of his ribcage was a deep, jagged groove. It wasn't a direct hit, but a ricochet from when Garris had dumped his carbine, or perhaps a splinter of stone thrown up by a wild hoof. The skin was torn open, bleeding heavily, mixing with the sweat on his scarred torso. "Sit," Sadie commanded. It was the first time she had ever given him an order. Harlan looked at her, his pale blue eyes registering a flicker of surprise. Then slowly he sat on the edge of his narrow canvas cot. Sadie went to work. She hauled a bucket of water to the fire, throwing a chunk of pine into the embers to bring it to a boil. She found his small wooden medical box. Inside was a bottle of carbolic acid, a curved needle, and coarse silk thread. When she returned to the cot, she soaked a rag in the hot water and began washing the blood from his side. He was a map of violence. Up close, without the heavy layers of wool and hide, she saw the true toll the frontier had taken on him. A massive puckered scar on his shoulder from a bear's claws. The crooked, incorrectly set ribs on his right side. The jagged white line of a knife wound across his collarbone. He was a man held together by stubbornness and scar tissue. "This is going to burn," she warned, uncorking the carbolic acid. "Pour it." Harlan grunted, gripping the edge of the cot. She poured. The acid bubbled violently as it hit the open wound. Harlan's knuckles turned stark white, and the cords in his thick neck stood out like iron cables, but he didn't make a sound. Not a groan. Not a sigh. Sadie threaded the needle. Her hands, which had been shaking uncontrollably 10 minutes prior, were now dead steady. She took a breath, pinched the torn edges of his skin together, and drove the needle through. She felt him flinch, a microscopic tightening of his muscles. The physical proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the immense heat radiating off his bare skin. She could smell the pine pitch, the sweat, and the sharp tang of copper blood. For months they had lived together without crossing an invisible boundary, acting as parallel lines that never intersected. Now her hands were slick with his blood, pulling the very seams of his flesh back together. She tied off the fifth and final stitch, snipping the silk thread with a small pair of iron scissors. She grabbed a clean length of cotton cloth and wrapped it tightly around his torso to keep the wound clean. "Done," she whispered, stepping back. Harlan didn't move immediately. He looked down at the neat row of black stitches binding his ribs. Then he looked up at her. You've got a steady hand, Sadie. It wasn't a compliment about her sewing. It was an acknowledgement of everything. The rifle shot, the blood, the grit. He reached for a clean wool shirt and pulled it on with a grimace. He stood up, towering over her in the dim light of the cabin. He walked over to a loose stone in the hearth, pried it up with his hunting knife, and pulled out a small leather pouch. He turned back to her and tossed the pouch onto the rough-hewn table. The heavy clink of silver coins echoed in the quiet room. "There's $20 in there." Harlan said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "More than enough for stage fare back east or a stake in Cheyenne. The snow's mostly gone. The pass is open." Sadie stared at the leather pouch. The silence in the cabin suddenly felt incredibly heavy, suffocating. "Your brother sold you." Harlan continued, looking at the fire instead of her. "I bought an insurance policy for the winter. Winter's over. You kept the fire lit. You kept the wolves off the porch. You earned your keep. You don't owe me nothing, and you don't belong to me." He was giving her an out. He was setting the bird free, fully expecting it to fly away from the frozen, brutal cage of the timberline. It was the most honorable thing a man had ever done for her, and it broke her heart. Sadie looked at the money. Then she looked at the cramped, freezing canvas cot beneath the window, where Harlan had slept every single night for 5 months, guarding the door. She looked at the massive wooden bed in the corner, piled high with furs, where she had slept in absolute warmth and safety. She walked to the table. She picked up the leather pouch. Harlan's jaw tightened. He finally looked at her, his expression a fortress of stoicism, bracing for the goodbye. Sadie walked past him. She went to the wooden shelf above the stove where they kept an empty coffee tin for storing matches. She dropped the heavy leather pouch of coins into the tin and slammed the lid shut. She turned back to face him, crossing her arms over her chest. "I'm not done with my shift," she said firmly. Harlan stared at her, the mask slipping just a fraction. A deep, quiet confusion crossed his scarred face. "Life up here ain't for a young woman, Sadie. It's hard. It only gets harder." "I've done soft living in the settlements." Sadie shot back, her voice sharp but remarkably tender. "It means getting beaten by a brother and sold to a stranger. I prefer the hard living up here." She walked over to the canvas cot beneath the window. She grabbed the thin, moth-eaten blanket he used, balled it up, and threw it onto the floor. "Draft comes right through that wall," she said, looking him dead in the eye. "It's bad for your ribs. You're sleeping in the bed from now on." Harlan didn't move. He looked at the discarded blanket, then at the wide, fur-lined bed in the corner, and finally back at her. The air between them crackled, the unspoken shift settling over the room like fresh snow. "It's a big bed, Harlan," she said softly. "I reckon there's room for 2. The old mountain man stood perfectly still for a long time. Then very slowly a rough, genuine smile touched the corners of his scarred mouth, a rare and beautiful thing. "Reckon there is," he murmured. The first night in the heavy wooden bed, the air in the cabin was thick enough to chew. Sadie lay on the inside, her back to the log wall. The mattress of dried pine needles rustled loudly with every breath she took. Harlan lay on the outside edge. He was rigidly straight, his massive shoulders squared to the ceiling, his hands resting flat on his stomach. He was a man who had spent a lifetime taking up as little space as possible in a hostile world, and right now he was trying to disappear entirely. There was a full foot of empty space between them under the heavy wolf-skin furs. The fire burned low, casting long, erratic shadows across the rafters. The wind, which had howled for 5 months straight, was finally dead. The silence was deafening. Sadie turned her head. In the dim orange light, Harlan's profile looked like it had been hacked out of granite with a dull chisel. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked rapidly near his ear. He was terrified. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. This man who had dragged a broken leg through a blizzard and stared down a mountain lion without blinking was paralyzed by the proximity of a woman who actually wanted to be there. She shifted. The pine needles crunched. She slid across the foot of empty space until her shoulder brushed his arm. Harlan flinched. Not a withdrawal, but a sharp, involuntary tightening of every muscle in his body. He didn't turn his head. "I'm too big, Sadie," he whispered to the ceiling, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I'm clumsy. And I'm old. My hands are like sandpaper. I don't need silk." She answered quietly. She reached out from under the furs. Her fingers, still carrying the faint scent of carbolic acid and wood smoke, found his arm. She traced the thick, corded muscle of his forearm, moving up to where the edge of his cotton shirt met his shoulder. She could feel the erratic, heavy thud of his pulse. Harlan slowly turned his head. His ice-blue eyes found hers in the dark. There was no lust in them, not yet. Only a deep, profound searching. He was looking for the trap. He was looking for the lie. When he didn't find one, a long, shuddering breath escaped his lungs as if he had been holding it since November. He moved. It wasn't rushed. It was deliberate and incredibly careful. He rolled onto his side, facing her. He raised a massive, calloused hand, letting it hover an inch above her face. His hand was shaking. Slowly he lowered it, his rough thumb brushing lightly against her cheekbone. The contrast was startling, the sheer destructive power contained in his grip, dialed back to an almost agonizing gentleness. Sadie closed her eyes and leaned into his palm. There were no wild, breathless declarations. The West didn't leave room for poetry. There was only the pulling back of the furs, the shedding of cotton, and the sliding together of two people who had nearly frozen to death in their own lives. When he finally pulled her against his chest, the heat of his scarred body was overwhelming. Sadie buried her face in the crook of his neck, inhaling the scent of pine pitch and man, and for the first time in her life she wept. Not from sorrow, from the absolute terrifying relief of being caught. Spring bled into a short, violent summer. The mountain exploded into color. Indian paintbrush and purple lupine choked the valleys. The snowmelt turned the creek into a roaring torrent of white water. For Sadie, the season was a revelation. Survival was no longer a desperate hour-by-hour wager against the cold. It was a rhythmic, exhausting, deeply satisfying labor. They worked side by side. They didn't talk much. They didn't have to. A language evolved between them based entirely on motion and necessity. She knew when to hand him the skinning knife before he asked. He knew exactly how much green hickory to put on the smokehouse fire without looking at her meat racks. In the evenings they sat on the rough-hewn porch Harlan had built in June. The air would cool smelling of ozone and crushed sweetgrass. Harlan would smoke a carved briar pipe, his heavy arm draped over the back of the bench, his fingers idly playing with the ends of Sadie's hair. She watched the sunset paint the jagged peaks in bruised shades of violet and gold. She had come up this mountain a piece of property, a $50 transaction. Now her hands were calloused. Her face was browned by the high-altitude sun, and she owned the ground she stood on. More importantly, she owned herself. Harlan had never once treated her as a subordinate. In the brutal arithmetic of the frontier, they were equals. He provided the anchor, she provided the compass. But the frontier has a long memory, and it rarely lets a debt go unpaid. August brought a stifling, dry heat that turned the pine needles to tinder and baked the mud to cracked ceramic. The creek dropped to a quiet trickle. They were down in the lower valley 2 miles from the cabin. Harlan was knee-deep in a beaver pond resetting a submerged trap, while Sadie sat on the muddy bank, carefully scraping the fat from a stretched pelt with a dull bone knife. The heavy Henry rifle rested across her lap. It was a permanent fixture now, as natural to her as her own right arm. The roan gelding tied to a nearby alder bush threw its head and let out a sharp, warning snort. Harlan froze in the water. He didn't stand up straight. He simply turned his head, his hand dropping beneath the surface to rest on the handle of his heavy hunting knife. Sadie stopped scraping. She picked up the rifle. 3 riders were picking their way through the dense willow thicket on the far side of the pond. The brush cracked and snapped beneath the hooves of their mounts. They were following the creek bed up toward the cabin. Sadie stood up her thumb, naturally finding the hammer of the Henry. She squinted against the glaring afternoon sun. The lead rider was slumped in the saddle, his hat pulled low. The 2 men behind him sat tall, their dust dusters swept back over the cantles of their saddles to expose heavy, low-slung revolvers. They rode like men who were hunting. The lead rider pulled up at the edge of the pond. He pushed his hat back. Sadie's blood ran completely cold. It was Caleb. He looked like a corpse that had been dug up and put on a horse. His face was gaunt, his skin a sickly yellow beneath a layer of grey dirt. His clothes hung off him in rags, but the eyes were the same shifty, desperate, constantly calculating the angles. "Well now." Caleb rasped, his voice bouncing off the water. He looked at Harlan, then at Sadie. A crooked yellow smile split his face. "Look at this, playing house in the mud." Harlan waded slowly out of the water. He didn't take his eyes off the 2 men flanking Caleb. They were hard cases. Drifters with dead eyes and trigger fingers twitching with nervous energy. Harlan stopped at the edge of the bank, placing his body squarely between the riders and Sadie. "You're trespassing," Harlan said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the low rumble of an impending rock slide. "Trespassing." The man to Caleb's right sneered. He had a face like a hatchet and a thick, drooping mustache. "This is open territory, old man. We go where we please." Caleb held up a shaking hand, playing the peacemaker. "Now hold on, boys. Let me handle my family." He looked at Sadie, his eyes narrowing. "You look good, Sadie. Fleshed out. The mountain agrees with you." Sadie didn't lower the rifle. She leveled it dead at her brother's chest. "What do you want, Caleb?" Caleb feigned offense, pressing a hand to his chest. "Is that any way to greet your flesh and blood I came to get you? I told these boys here, Boone and Miller, that I made a terrible mistake. I sold my own sister to a wild man in a moment of weakness. I've come to pay the $50 back and take you home." It was a lie. A sloppy, desperate lie. Sadie could smell the cheap whiskey and fear radiating off him from across the pond. Caleb didn't have 50 cents, let alone $50. He had promised these men something else. He had promised them a soft target. An old man's winter cache of furs gold and a woman to pass between them. "I don't have a brother," Sadie said, her voice ringing out crisp and hard. "My brother died at Fort Laramie last November." Caleb's fake smile vanished. The mask slipped, revealing the rat underneath. "Don't play high and mighty with me, you ungrateful bitch. I fed you for 10 years. You belong to me. Now put that toy gun down and get on the back of my horse before I let Boone teach you some manners." Boone, the hatchet-faced man, spat into the water. He slowly moved his hand toward the handle of his Colt. "She's a feisty one, Caleb. Might have to break her in again." "Don't touch that iron," Harlan said. Boone paused, looking down at the older man standing in the mud. He laughed, a dry, barking sound. "Or what grandpa you gonna gun me to death? You got a knife. We got 3 guns. Math ain't your strong suit." "Math is fine," Harlan replied, his voice dropping an octave. "I figure I'll gut you before you clear leather. Sadie takes the one on the left, and Caleb dies crying in the mud. Seems balanced to me." The absolute certainty in Harlan's voice made Boone hesitate. In the Wild West, hesitation was usually fatal. "Caleb," Sadie called out, her voice dangerously calm. "Turn the horses around. If you ride away right now, you live. If you draw, you die here. And I will leave you for the crows." Caleb looked at Sadie. Really looked at her. He expected the cowering girl he had traded away for a mule and a rifle. Instead, he saw a woman, standing with her feet planted shoulder-width apart. Her eyes cold and empty, holding a repeating rifle with the casual, terrifying ease of a seasoned killer. For a second, Caleb's survival instinct kicked in. He reached for his reins to pull his horse away. But Miller, the third rider, was already out of patience. "Screw this!" Miller snarled, yanking his revolver from its holster. The pond exploded into violence. Time fractured. It shattered into bright, deafening shards of motion and sound. Miller fired first. The shot went wild, thucking into the mud a foot from Harlan's boots. Harlan didn't draw a gun. He moved with a sudden explosive speed that defied his massive frame. He lunged forward, splashing violently into the shallows, his hand whipping up from his side. The heavy hunting knife left his fingers in a silver blur. It buried itself to the hilt in Miller's chest, dead center. Miller didn't even scream. His eyes rolled back, and he pitched backward off his horse, splashing heavily into the reeds. Boone roared his Colt clearing leather. He aimed down at Harlan, who was caught exposed in the water, weaponless. Crack! The Henry rifle barked. Boone jerked violently in the saddle, his shot firing harmlessly into the sky, as Sadie's .44 caliber slug tore through his right shoulder, shattering the joint. His Colt spun into the water. Boone screamed, clutching his ruined arm. His horse panicked, rearing up and bucking him into the shallows. He scrambled wildly in the mud, trying to find his lost gun with his left hand coughing up water and blood. Caleb hadn't drawn. He sat frozen on his horse, his mouth hanging open in sheer terror. The ambush he had planned had evaporated in less than 3 seconds. Harlan waded through the water, ignoring the thrashing Boone. He walked straight to Miller's floating corpse, gripped the handle of his knife, and yanked it free. He turned toward Caleb, his chest heaving, the blade dripping crimson into the muddy water. The look on the mountain man's face was primal, a raw, territorial fury. "Harlan, stop!" Sadie's voice cut through the ringing in the air. Harlan paused. He looked back at her. Sadie walked slowly down the bank. The Henry still raised the barrel, smoking. She stepped into the shallow water, her boots sinking into the silt, until she was standing 10 feet from Caleb's horse. Caleb stared down at her, trembling violently. He raised both his hands, palms out. Sadie, please. I didn't know they were going to shoot. I just wanted my sister back. Please." He was crying, real pathetic tears streaming through the grime on his face. He looked weak. He looked exactly like the man who had traded her away for $50. Sadie felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity. Just a profound, hollow disgust. The invisible chain that had bound her to this man, to her past, snapped cleanly in her chest. "Get off the horse, Caleb," she ordered. Caleb hesitated. "What?" Sadie worked the lever of the Henry. The brass casing ejected, spinning through the air, and a fresh round clattered into the chamber. She aimed the rifle directly at his face. "Get off the horse." Caleb scrambled out of the saddle landing awkwardly in the mud. He fell to his knees, clasping his hands together. "Sadie, don't do this. I'm your brother. We got the same blood." "Blood just means we shared a house," Sadie said, her voice stripped of all emotion. "It don't mean we share a life." She stepped closer. "Take off the boots." Caleb's eyes widened in horror. "Sadie, we're 100 miles from a settlement. The rocks. They'll tear my feet to pieces." "Take them off." She pressed the hot muzzle of the rifle against his forehead. Sobbing, Caleb reached down with shaking hands and pulled off his worn leather boots. He tossed them into the mud. Now the coat. He stripped off the ragged wool coat, leaving him in just a filthy torn shirt and canvas trousers. "Turn around," Sadie commanded. Caleb slowly stood up in the mud in his bare feet. He turned to face the dense, unforgiving wall of the Black Hills stretching endlessly to the south. "Start walking," Sadie said. Caleb looked over his shoulder, his face a mask of absolute despair. "You're killing me, Sadie. It's a death sentence." "No," Sadie replied, lowering the rifle just a fraction. "I'm giving you exactly what you gave me, a chance to survive the mountain. What you do with it is your business. But if I ever see your face again, I won't hesitate." She raised the rifle into the air and fired a shot directly over his head. Caleb screamed, flinching away from the blast, and then he ran. He stumbled through the mud, crashing blindly into the willow thicket, tearing his clothes on the thorns. They listened to the frantic sound of his bare feet, breaking branches growing fainter and fainter, until the mountains swallowed him whole. Sadie stood in the water for a long time, watching the spot where he had disappeared. She slowly lowered the rifle. Her hands weren't shaking. Harlan waded over to her. He didn't speak. He reached down, picked up the discarded boots and coat, and threw them into the brush. He gathered the reins of Caleb's horse and Boone's horse. Boone had managed to crawl onto the bank, groaning in agony, clutching his shattered shoulder. "Wrap it tight." Harlan growled down at Boone, tossing him a dirty rag from Caleb's saddlebag. "You got one horse? You can ride out or you can bleed out. Choose quick." Boone didn't argue. Cursing through clenched teeth, he managed to pull himself onto the surviving horse, kicking it into a frantic stumble back down the trail they had come from. When the valley was quiet again, Harlan turned to Sadie. She was looking down at her hands, smeared with gunpowder and mud. He reached out and gently wrapped his massive, scarred hands over hers, pushing the rifle barrel toward the ground. "It's done," he said softly. Sadie looked up at him. The ice in her chest melted, replaced by a sudden fierce warmth. "Yeah, it's done." Winter returned to the Wyoming Territory like a falling iron curtain. By November, the snow was back to the eaves of the cabin. The wind shrieked around the corners, a violent physical force trying to tear the structure apart. Inside, the fire roared in the stone hearth, casting a warm orange glow over the immaculately swept dirt floor. The smell of roasting venison and wild sage filled the air. Sadie sat in the sturdy rocking chair Harlan had built from river birch. She was knitting a heavy wool sock, her needles clicking in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She wore the heavy buffalo hide coat draped over her shoulders, but the cabin was stiflingly warm. Harlan sat on the floor near the hearth, carefully oiling the brass receiver of the Henry rifle. He paused, looking over at her. The jagged scar on his face softened in the firelight. He didn't ask her if she was afraid of the dark anymore. He didn't sleep on a canvas cot by the door. Sadie looked up, catching his eye. A small, knowing smile played on her lips. She set the knitting down, stood up, and walked over to him. She knelt on the hearthstone, taking the oiled rag from his massive hand. $50, a battered Henry rifle, and a half-blind pack mule. That was the price of a human life. But out here where the snow never melted and the rules of the world were written in ice and blood, they had found something money couldn't buy. They hadn't just survived the West. They had conquered it together. Sadie leaned in and kissed the scarred corner of his mouth. "Fire's burning hot tonight, old man," she whispered. Harlan pulled her against his chest, the immense quiet strength of him surrounding her like a fortress. "Reckon it'll keep," he murmured. "Reckon it'll keep a long time. The frontier breaks the weak and hardens the strong, but for Sadie and Harlan it did something entirely different. It forged them into something unbreakable. They proved that true love isn't found in soft words, but in shared fires, loaded rifles, and standing your ground when the world comes to take what's yours. Did Sadie make the right call with Caleb, or was she too harsh? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this gritty tale of survival and romance hooked you, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more untamed stories of the Wild West.